What we're trying to achieve is the ability to do better science with involving more people, and to share data to mutual benefit. The Fluency Bank is actually premised on an idea that started in the 1980s called the Child Language Data Exchange System, which was founded by Brian McWhinney at Carnegie Mellon and one of my dissertation advisors, Catherine Snow at Harvard. Catherine Snow is no longer involved in these projects, but Brian McWhinney continues to be and is involved in Fluency Bank with me. The idea then was that people kept going to the government in the United States to ask for money to study children's language development, you know, in dribs and drabs, you know, a few kids at a time. And then from what everybody could tell, all the data wound up sitting in file cabinets, and nobody shared them. And so they had the idea to go to the NIH in the United States and say, well, what if we established an internet-based repository? They were already pretty senior people, so they knew they had influence. They could probably convince people to share, unlike junior people. And they said, we're going to develop rules for how you make a transcript of language behavior. That way we can share them. You know, it'd be one thing just to be able to grab stuff off the internet, but you couldn't really share them if they were all made differently. So they developed conventions for how to make files. They got a website going, and they also started to develop software, free software that would allow you to go through the data and do things with the data. It was such a raging success. It's actually been called a national treasure by the NIH, that a few years later, they went back and they started another similar effort for aphasia called Aphasia Bank. Mm-hmm. Then a few years later, they established another one called Fawn Bank for children's speech development and disorders. And then finally, 5 years ago, we went in and we said, you know, we want ours. We want a Fluency Bank. And we were really, really pleased that both the NIH funded it as well as the NSF, the National Science Foundation. And it is more than stuttering in Fluency Bank. It is kind of writ large. It's about how do children learn to put sentences together and, you know, have them sound native and fluent. And why do some people have trouble? Not only people who stutter, but people who clutter, even children who are second language learners or bilingual, and children who have expressive language problems. So there, and we sort of want to know how thoughts get out of anybody's head into their speech. So psycholinguists have been putting data into the bank as well. So it's young, but it's kind of going well, we think. And that's sort of how it got started. And its goal is to see if we can't have more researchers work together to figure out stuttering and cluttering, rather than everybody working in their own, the term we use so often is silos. And for some major researchers, it's become, when I talk to them, more like what I call estate planning. So we have these really big studies in our field, like the Illinois Stuttering Research Project with Ehud Yeri, or the Purdue Stuttering Project with Ann Smith and Chris Weber. And what happens to those data when people retire? All of those folks are retiring. How do we make sure somebody doesn't wander into a lab and just throw it all in the dumpster? And so we're really trying very hard, and we've been very lucky. In those two cases, we've been lucky to gather not everything, but we've gathered a fair proportion of the data so that, and we're going to have them up there so that people can use them, so that if people have new ideas based on old data, they can do something with them. So what's really interesting about Childus, which has been around since 1985, is that over the years they got funding from the National Science Foundation in the United States to make it international. And so there have been linguists working in multiple locations to develop grammars for a dozen languages.
Wow, okay.
So we have the ability to analyze data in English, but we have it for Mandarin, Cantonese, Dutch, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Hebrew. I know I'm forgetting something. And again, the languages differ, but the software is able to to analyze no matter what language the person is talking in, you can do certain things in any of those languages, and we continue to develop grammars. One of the things that Dr. McWhinney and I had to do that was kind of interesting, we didn't really predict it was going to be so hard, was in the first year of the grant, we had to develop international codes for marking stuttered events. It turned out everybody had been doing that differently all over the world. And we had to develop codes that could be used in Chinese as easily as they could be used in English, for instance. And that turned out to be kind of an interesting challenge, because in computing, you're not supposed to use ambiguous things. You're not supposed to, you know, have a symbol stand for more than one thing. So we wound up using mathematical operators. We wanted to be able for data to be contributed from any language. And one of the things that have been happening, as I said, was that every lab marks stuttering in their own particular way. And a lot of it just we couldn't sort of point to one and go, oh, that'll work, because they all tended to be very much based on English. As I said, the bank has a pretty broad vision. Right now, if you go, it's only less than 5 years old. And if you go up there, it's got data from people that, not just people who stutter. In fact, one of the things that we don't have enough of, and I'll just make the pitch right off, is we don't have very much from people who clutter. We have actually only one sample. The ICA developed a beautiful protocol for gathering data from people who clutter, but so far we really haven't had people volunteer to do it, although they can do it from a distance. It's not that hard to do. The instructions can be downloaded. You can sit in front of your computer and do it like this and then upload it. So we're going to want to push for that. But we are looking at people who have fluency problems because they have expressive language disorders, or we have bilingual language learning toddlers. We have children with epilepsy in one of the data sets. We have, we just received new data, it's not formatted yet, from children with Down syndrome who stutter. So it's a big tent. It's a big tent. It's meant to be that way. And it's not just research data at this point either. It's teaching resources. So the American NSA and the American Friends groups agreed to help us recruit speakers who stutter, both children and adults, who gave us standard interviews, so that speech language pathologists can learn more about stuttering. We ask questions about stuttering of them, so it's not just speech samples so that people listen to their fluency. You have to be listening to what they're saying, because we thought that was very important, that too many therapists don't understand stuttering. And so we wanted to give them an opportunity to sort of meet people who stutter and listen to their stories. There's at the site in the lower, if you're visualizing the Fluency Bank site, which is fluency.talkbank.org. In the lower left-hand corner, there's teaching resources. Again, this is not something we invented only for this project. We've been at the other banks. There have been teaching resources for clinicians in training, or for students, developmental psychology, human development students for the Child Language Bank, for instance. So literally almost before our first checks arrived from the government, we actually started the teaching site, because in the United States, so many of our meetings for people who stutter were held in the summer. And even though our money hadn't arrived, I just packed up my cameras and we went off to the NSA, and people were kind of overjoyed. If you ask them, is there something you'd like to say to a speech language pathologist in training? We had a lot of takers. And right now we have almost 36 interviews from adults who stutter. And we have 12 interviews from children who stutter. And they are being used a lot. I've been asking the American ASHA, American Speech and Hearing Association, has a listserv. And I went out to ask people, is anybody using these teaching resources? And a lot of people wrote and said, oh yes, we're definitely using them. And actually some clinicians wrote in and said that they were using them to start conversations with their clients. Because so many of the themes that you see in those 36 adult interviews are kind of, they're somewhat universal. Not everybody expresses exactly the same thoughts, but many of the things that people who stutter grapple with are common enough that some clinicians from some well-known practices, I was kind of surprised and gratified, basically said, well, you know, there are some that they like to play for their clients to show that they're not alone when they have certain kinds of feelings about their stuttering, and how they handle it. So that's kind of interesting. I enjoy it. It's something I wanted to do for years. And it turned out to be surprisingly hard to do maybe a decade ago. And then the time just seemed right. About 5 years ago, when we sent in the proposal, the NIH said, yeah. On the website at fluency.talkbank.org, we actually have an advice on how to contribute. And there are two major forms of contribution. One is research data. Those get a little bit thorny depending upon how researchers consented their subjects. So there are cases where we can't get things. It turned out that the Purdue project could not donate its audio, only its transcripts. For other groups, what we've been able to do is strike a deal to put the materials behind a password, and then people contact me or contact Dr. McWhinney, and we ascertain that you're going to do okay things with it. You're not going to stick it up on YouTube or something like that, and give you the password. We are showing younger researchers how to write their consents, so that, because again, we've had 40 years of experience with the other banks, we know how to write a consent form so that we don't have this problem later. Anybody who stutters or clutters or has a fluency profile that they think it might be interesting to people can literally self-volunteer. We have the forms up there. They can have a friend take an iPhone and video them. They can Zoom themselves. And then what we do to help people is we do transcribe what they volunteer so that people can sort of find their way around the documents as well as the videos. We're always having a video or an audio and a transcript so that people can go through and sort of see things in a more rounded fashion. And we have special technology that puts them together, which is kind of nifty. So as you hear a person talk, if you go particularly to the teaching resources, which is called Voices of Adults Who Stutter, as they're talking, their transcript scrolls with what they're saying. And people can work with us. Anybody can donate information. And we're trying very hard to reach out. Right now, I'm looking very much at all of the young funded researchers around the world and having discussions with them about how do they collect data that could be shared in the future. Because again, human subject protection is a very important thing. We do not want to take data from people without appropriate safeguards. That's been interesting because at least in the United States, and I don't really get this sense around the world, but fluency researchers in the United States have always been kind of a close-knit community that don't interact tremendously with other communities. And so, as I said, people in child language development and disorder and speech development and aphasia, you know, they've been going on 4 decades of sharing data with one another. And when that concept first arose, it actually was a little scary to some people. I was one of the first people to donate data. I donated my dissertation data to Childis. And you get these weird feelings like, suppose they think I didn't do the work carefully enough. Exactly. Suppose they think I'm sloppy. Or maybe they'll find something from my data that I won't agree with. You know, what am I going to do? Maybe people won't acknowledge where they got data from. And none of that happened. None of it happened. And so now when I listen to people kind of hem and hash, is this a good idea? I don't know. I'm like, it is a good idea. Tell me what you're afraid of. About the only fear that we really can't get past is the legitimate one, as I said, of having not gotten appropriate consent from your participants to feel that you can safely give the data to another authority, even though we have password protection for research data, and even if we're going to de-identify everything.
Yeah.
So in one project, for instance, we were given video. We were actually given the video and we just extracted the audio. We just figured it was old data that hadn't been gathered with anybody imagining something like this, and we just didn't want to presume to put up pictures that could be identified by people. So we, in all the years that the other banks have been operating, we've never had anybody want their data taken down. On all of the consent forms that we advise people use, and even if they didn't sign a consent form like that, if somebody came to us and said, I want my data gone, it would be gone. We've actually not had any instances of that over the years on any of the banks. The teaching resources that I gathered, because I did all the gathering for those interviews, both the adults and the children, they were told from the very beginning they wouldn't even be behind a password because we wanted them available to students, and we didn't want to, you know, we didn't see any easy way to make them available to students unless they were fully open on the internet. So everybody that volunteered knew that their data were not even going to be behind a password like the research data. Some of them were so proud to give those interviews, we actually had to make them take off their name tags. Yeah. And we're just very honest. We have forms, and we, over the years at all the banks, we share them with other researchers, and we give people decisions that they can make. Like for my research, a parent of a child, for instance, can say, you can have my video of me and my kid, no problem, all right? Or no, you can only extract the audio. I don't want anybody to know who I am. And we actually have a fallback position, which almost nobody has picked over the years, which says, I don't care, I don't want you to use the audio or the video, but if you just have a transcript of what I said and you make sure my name is nowhere to be found, that's fine. What we actually find in the day and age of social media is very few people opt to not include everything. They just are, if they think it's for a good cause.
Exactly.
And we don't talk about overly sensitive things. We do talk about sensitive things in stuttering, but we don't ask people about their sex lives or things like that. People have been overwhelmingly generous. People do not really seem to object. And I almost think that what we call the IRBs, institutional review boards, in many countries they're actually an obstacle. And Professor McWhinney and I have talked about this, because in many American institutions, the sort of template for being in a study says the researcher will only keep the data for so many years and then destroy it. And they're not aware that starting a couple of years ago, when I go to the National Institutes of Health in the United States and I say I want to do research, there's actually a mandatory part now of all of those proposals that says, what is your data sharing plan?
Yeah.
You can't get money unless you share. And so we had a great time with the Fluency Bank application because we hit that page and it said, what is your data sharing plan? And we said, this is a data sharing plan. So yeah, I mean, we could easily advertise through social media to get people involved. And I think social media has been good at getting the word out for some of these kinds of things. It's certainly been very helpful to the organizations that wind up helping us, like the ICA, the NSA. You know, I don't think too many people spend their weekends browsing my lab website. You know, so I think social media has been very powerful, and I think social media will eventually be powerful in convincing many research boards, and the Americans are by no means the most draconian. I'm dealing with a number of countries where researchers want to donate data, and what's getting in their way has nothing to do with their willingness or their participants, it's the government. Okay. The government just believes it's dangerous to share data. What we're hearing is that when people listen to the adults who stutter talk about what they need, and to some extent even the children talking about what they think they need, that I think it has changed. We're getting that feedback, particularly from less experienced faculty members trying to train therapists, that if it's sort of, again, a vicious catch-22, that if you're not a very well-trained specialist in fluency disorders, you're not seeing very many clients because they're obviously not hunting you up. There's no reason for them to. And none of your students get to interact with people who stutter or clutter. And it just becomes kind of the poor get poorer and poorer and poorer. And so we are kind of happy that it's starting to make at least the messages from those individuals who stutter and clutter are starting, at least their messages are being heard by people. And so my short-term goal, since the project is only 4.5 years old, it's a preschooler, is to grow it. You know, I was keeping tabs on how many files we have. We have about over 500 files from about somewhat less than 300 individuals right now. But we're looking at what's been going on with the Childist project, which is the oldest. And I was just printing something out that it currently has the support of 2,400 researchers in 38 countries.
Wow.
It has thousands and thousands and thousands of records of people learning to talk in all sorts of language communities. And it's just become invaluable. Nobody can imagine doing work in that field without it. And the same thing is true now of brain damage and aphasia, that without Aphasia Bank, the field could not have gotten to where it is. So I think that, you know, I think that's our immediate goal, is to just to make it more robust. And I certainly want to make it less Anglo-centric. It's not ours. It's not ours. It's ours. We're the ones like the in the United States, like the Salvation Army out there with the bell this time of year asking for money. We're the ones who go and get the money, but to enable the site to stay alive and for us to help researchers to convert their data into this usable format. But it's really organically part of the community itself. It's not really, it belongs to all of us. It doesn't belong to me or Brian or anybody. No. It just makes you feel good, because the kind of work that you can get done by sharing data sets. Let me just give you one fast idea. So as I said, the very first bank for children's language development currently has somewhere close to 8,000 records from children learning to speak English only between the ages of 2 and 6, just 2 and 6. So Brian and I went to the government again. We said, we've been using norms for children's language development for assessing whether or not children are typical or not, and what we need to help them in therapy. We've been using norms that go back to the 1970s. Wow. And now we have 6,000 to 8,000 records of children. The biggest norming population we could find in that age range was under 100 children, for individual ways that clinicians are taught to diagnose children. And we said, can we just go back to the data bank and start pulling down those records and see if we can develop better measures of children's language development, and develop measures that don't discriminate against children who speak non-standard dialects of a language. And they were so excited. And so that's what we're doing. So I think but it takes time. It takes time to accumulate that body of data that we can then deploy the data in such interesting ways to help people. Yeah, people are starting to, with the 36 adults, people have started, I got some interesting feedback that classroom assignments have started to probe themes. And because we got the data directly from people, we weren't going through researchers, we got them from attendance at the National Stuttering Association meeting. The stories were very different. Some people had gone to therapy and had wonderful times and wonderful success. They had different kinds of therapy. We expected to find, people preferring one kind of therapy over another. Nope. Different strokes for different folks. Different people found different things that helped them. Some people had not had good experiences with therapy, and they were able to tell us what they thought were bad experiences, always with the thought that if they could tell clinicians in training what wasn't helpful, that maybe they could avoid mistakes in the future. So I think that, you know, we get some really interesting discussions from people, and they are different. They're meant to be different. The interviews from people who stutter, telling other people about themselves is a different kind of data. It can be used for research, clearly, but it's a very different kind of data than the data that we're getting from people who decided to look at language development in children who stutter, or reaction time in adults who stutter, you know, and things like that. We gave all the adults something called the OASES, which is an instrument that looks at affect and cognition. And impact of stuttering on a person's life. And those are actually up there with the interviews, so that people can appreciate stuttering from a very large perspective. We want to get away from the notion that stuttering or cluttering is just your speech, because that just seems really narrow. And it seems to have led to some really, really uninformative interventions, at least in some cases. I really would encourage them to think about having an interview with me or with one another, and videotape it, so that we can make people around the world more cognizant about cluttering. I mean, if people don't understand stuttering very well, they understand cluttering a lot less.
Yes.
And I think that the only way to give people information, I guess I'm just old-fashioned in this regard, I don't think you get a whole lot out of textbooks alone. I think that you need to be able to listen to people, and you need to hear the behavior, but you also need to hear the people. So I would love to sort of entreat people who clutter around the world, who visit your site, or members of any of the other cluttering groups, to really talk to me about maybe donating an interview. So that's, yeah, I would love that.